All right, we're live. Hello. Hello, welcome back to the Scale Up Leader, the podcast and video show where you learn about how to scale your leadership. Today we have Cliff Hazel, formerly of Spotify, where he helped them grow from 700 to 5,000 people. And now he helps startups remove growth pains from that, often using that experience and other things as well. So somewhat similar to what I do, but Cliff has some very different experiences to me. And today we'll be talking about what he does and particularly about a concept that he's involved with. And I'm not sure whether you invented it or worked with it or popularized it, but you're certainly very prominent in it, flight levels thinking. So great to have you here today, Cliff. Let me pull you on screen. There you go. Great to have you here today, Cliff. How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show today, Richard. It's nice to be here. Yeah.
Excellent. So we were talking. So before we get into the topic, we met originally through Alesh. I think it was Alesh Balshar or something like that. I think it was there's a podcast, and we just seem to have a fair bit in common with similar experiences in some ways and different experiences in others. You were at Spotify. I was at Google and Amazon, and a lot has been written about cultures and ways of working in these companies. And I want to ask you, from your experience, what of the part of your experience of Spotify is really relevant or important to scale ups? Like what do you learn from this and so on? And I have a take on this, but I'm happy to hear your take as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly a number of things. I mean, I chatted a little bit with Alesh about some of this stuff. It's funny how if you go on one podcast, you tend to end up on several others as well. But it's kind of a cool thing, actually, a sort of knock-on effect there. But to your question, what can we kind of learn from Spotify and what's sort of interesting about it? I think there's a lot of things that have been copied, and what I find interesting is that a lot of the things that get copied tend to be the sort of the very visible things. People, copy names and kind of structural aspects, but the cultural things, what actually makes people collaborate and work well together, sort of the general vibe of the company and the sort of thing. And I think part of that is because it's quite hard to articulate and put those things into crisp, clear words because, you have the sort of hand wavy, we talk about culture, or we talk about, kind of inclusion and all of these sort of topics, which are very important, but sometimes a little bit trickier to measure. And so when you look at something and you say, well, we put a coat of paint on all the teams, they're not called squads, all our community of practice, we changed them, they're now called guilds. It looks somehow successful and you can feel like you can point to something quite tangible. But the challenge is that sometimes I don't think that coat of paint necessarily is always the thing that's doing the big changes or helping in significant ways. So maybe we can explore a little bit about what does work.
The Spotify model, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Microphone, but change microphones, by the way, but hopefully you can still hear me okay.
All good. I hear you perfectly. Yep.
Cool.
Cool.
This is a Spotify model that you're talking about here with the squads and all of that, yeah?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things like, I mean, plenty of people have said there is a model. Some people have said there isn't a model. Some said there used to be a model and now there isn't a model. And I mean, I think the reality is that there's a lot of interesting things that you can learn from companies that have done stuff before. But I do a talk at a lot of conferences called Beyond Copy Paste Agile. And in there, I sort of tell the story about how we often copy and paste things from other companies. The key thing for me is not so much what we copy and paste, but like, do we actually have the challenges that they're facing? Because if you don't have a problem that's solved by squads, chapters, and guilds, I don't know. I mean, it might be fun to make a change. You can redesign your lounge, put a new coat of paint. Does it practically improve the livability of your house? Don't know. Maybe. Yeah, so I think that's the thing, is finding the stuff that actually makes the impact. And the biggest challenge of that is actually understanding within our organizations, what are the real problems that we actually face? What are the things that are sort of our bottleneck or our constraint or the thing that's limiting our ability to be better at the things we're trying to do? I mean, we could get all philosophical and go even broader than that, but I think fundamentally that's kind of the essence of it, is that, we copy and paste things without necessarily considering why do we need that thing from this company?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually really consistent with my experience as well. I mean, as you know, I work with the OKRs, and OKRs came from Google, and I spent 6 years at Google. They came from Intel via Google, via John Doerr and various others, and so on. And I find a lot of my clients come to me, they're interested in OKRs. And some of them have this situation where they sort of said, well, Google does this and Google's successful, so we should do the thing that Google was doing. Or they've hired someone who's ex-Google into their organization as an executive, perhaps, and they're trying to copy the whole thing just wholesale. But the challenge is that, or the problem with doing that is, well, why are you doing it? It's just that, like you say, you've got that, what's the problem that you're really trying to solve here? Because Google is a 150,000 person company now. I mean, Spotify must be tens of thousands by now, I guess. I don't know how big they are, but they're reasonably large. And Google's 150,000 people, and they've been doing this for 20 years, and they have a business model that's grown to be $100 billion worth of revenue or whatever it is now, and they have very different problems to your startup who's 30 people or 50 people or 200 people or 400 people or whatever we're at, and we've just raised the Series D or whatever we're doing. We have very different problems, and so copying their solution to their problems into your organization doesn't work. And I guess so what you're saying is that it's the same for the Spotify, this thing called the Spotify model. It's the same kind of challenge here, in that you want to start from the actual problem you're having.
I think that's the thing, is that, I mean, it's kind of tricky to know where to start, because often if you're trying to solve these kind of problems, you may not know what the problem is in the first place. You just know that you feel some sort of a pain point. And I think often what I see is companies, as they've grown fast, one of the things that you struggle with is that there's just so many people doing so many different things, and it almost feels a little bit like we're creating sort of this friction within the company in a way, because this team is trying to go left, that team is trying to go right, the exec team is trying to pull us forward. There's some kind of change initiative or improvement thing coming, maybe from HR or the development areas, and these kind of things just they bump into each other a bunch, and so figuring out some way to kind of move through that and say, well, which of these things are we actually going to consider as important? Because if we're all doing different things, we're not necessarily kind of moving in a coherent or related direction. And often I see that kind of struggle being a big part of the challenge that people are running into. So I spend a lot of time thinking about and working with companies on these problems, because, I mean, we even had this challenge at Spotify. You probably have heard, if you've seen some of the documentation and the stories and so on, this thing of autonomy versus alignment. Early in the stages of the company, it was very much all about autonomy. Every team is free to choose what they want to do. And I think that at some level, this is really powerful and profound, and changed a lot of people's perception. You could have a team that would figure out for themselves without necessarily having tons of oversight or kind of a lot of process or maybe bureaucracy that some people are used to in order to figure out which way to go. The challenge, of course, is that if you've got 200 teams and they're all going in different directions, how do you kind of create something that actually amplifies the efforts of everybody together? So one team is going left, one team is going right. We're actually conflicting with each other. Whereas if we're both going left and we can amplify each other's efforts, we can get the benefit of the teamwork and all of these smart brains that we have within the company. So I think a big part of it is figuring out how to do that.
So, at Spotify's scale, where there is, I was just going to say, at Spotify's scale, where there is like 200 teams, and there is that large scale, that's obviously a challenge. At what point does that become a challenge for a growing startup? Like, I mean, at what point do you find that to be a problem in startups commonly that you work with?
I mean, honestly, I think it starts as soon as you have more than one person in a company, but the compounding effect of there being more and more people, there's sort of an amount of tax that you pay in terms of coordination and syncing up. If everyone can sit around the same table or be in the same Slack channel, and you kind of know a little bit about what's happening in the other people's spaces, it's quite easy for me to say, okay, cool. Well, Rich is already on this thing, so I'm not going to do it. Or I'm doing this thing, and that's less important than what Rich is doing, so I can help out with what you're doing when you need me, that kind of thing. But the challenge is that as you get bigger and bigger, you need something to try to sort of, well, basically create that kind of structure or that system, a way that we can have that communication. And I think a lot of companies, they basically run into this challenge because they haven't designed those sort of systems. And then what they do is they overcorrect and they design something that's very bureaucratic, very slow, very painful. And you get a lot of folks who are kind of saying, well, we had a ton of autonomy, we had a lot of freedom, I had all this authority and power I could use to be able to make things effective. And now I feel like I've got to get sign off and go to a ton of meetings, have all of these conversations, get it approved by 75 people before I can do something. And figuring out that balance of not being like totally like chaotic and everybody can just do whatever the hell they want, some way to sort of align, and figuring out a bit of, okay, these things we're fine with people just experimenting, something like a hack week or just kind of an innovation project. But these things over here where it affects maybe the payments infrastructure or employment contracts or major legal implications, that kind of thing, perhaps those things we need to be a little bit more structured on. And we can figure out some sort of spaces in the middle where we can maybe be a little bit more relaxed or a bit more tightly constrained, depending on the type of thing that we need to do. So I think that overcorrecting is a lot of the pain. You're either too far in one direction where you're just too relaxed about everything, and maybe on the other side where a lot of companies feel that pain of overcorrection. And so finding that sweet spot, and specifically the sort of the more nuanced contexts in which something needs to be a little bit more free and open, if you're doing, as I said, innovation stuff, probably you need to make a few mistakes and try a few things that don't work. But if you're doing something that is heavy compliance based, you're launching a new bank in a new market or something like that, perhaps you need to comply with all the rules. You don't want to break GDPR. Certainly companies that are about to IPO don't want to have a big legal lawsuit or some kind of fine on their hands. So there's the context matters, really, is the key there.
So I think what I'm hearing you saying is that the scale of problems you have it almost never starts off at zero unless you're only one person in terms of this coordination overhead or the challenge of coordination, challenge of alignment. But as you grow, the problem gets progressively bigger, but then also your solution needs to map to that. So your solution to that, if you copy someone who like Google or Spotify or Amazon and copy their solutions wholesale and their processes and especially their bureaucracy, because they do have significant bureaucracy at that scale, in order to maintain alignment, suddenly you go from having not enough alignment to having too much alignment, and that's an equally bad problem. That's what I'm hearing you saying there. Is that right?
Yeah. I think that's the thing, is you have to figure out which of the things you do need really tight alignment on and which ones you can deal with the integration questions and problems later. But when you're building large scale platforms and you have real customers working on the product or using the product, pulling them in many different directions at the same time, there is a cost to that. And so figuring some of that stuff out. I spend a lot of my time kind of at the intersection of the product development and the organizational capabilities of the organization. So I'm interested in building the systems that can produce good products rather than directly being the product manager, although my background is in product management originally. I think it's really interesting to build those systems. How do you delegate responsibility and authority? How do you empower teams to be effectively autonomous while still connecting enough with the teams around them and figuring out, who do I actually need to connect to? Who do I need to involve and when, so that we don't, you may have heard a story of especially when you're doing early stage kind of innovation work, if you've got a little plant that's growing, right? And you put it out in a storm and it just gets battered by the rain and wind or something, it'll die. And so what you want to try to do is create a little bit of sort of I don't say a safer space or whatever, but like protected or kind of where you can nurture that idea so you don't kill it too early. And rather just, intentionally maybe down the line, you might say, oh, actually, we've got this forest of trees. We're not necessarily going to launch all of these products or ideas. We're going to test a few of them out in the market and maybe not take some of them further. But certainly at the earlier stages, you don't want to, you want to avoid a situation where you end up squashing things either because, it's just too painful or too hard to raise a problem. Politically it's maybe not feasible or expedient to do something, or I just, I see this pain point. And a lot of the time when I chat to companies, people say to me, hey, that thing that you talked about to our leadership team, that's exactly the thing that we've been saying for the last 5 years. I go, yeah, I know. I've been that person inside the company saying those things, and sometimes you have to hear it from outside. And teaching people to use those kind of tools and say, hey, here's a book that talks about the thing, or look at the smart YouTube person on YouTube talking about some idea, rather than always having to be the messenger and kind of, if the goal is the improvement, it doesn't matter where the idea comes from. We want the improvement to take effect, and so it's use the tools at your disposal.
Yeah, I find that a really interesting situation because, certainly in my experience, I've had the same thing where I've been an employee and I've said various things, and it just doesn't have an effect. Even if you're quite senior in an organization, sometimes people see you as having a particular agenda, and so while you might be the expert in that area, if you're trying to do something that might, like for example, at one stage I was running product at a startup, product engineering, and I suggested that what we should do is move what I would call product discovery and product development into the product team, because actually it was happening in a completely different team and it wasn't working. It was quite dysfunctional. But because I was the product guy, that was seen as an agenda to build an empire, and so it was discounted because of that. And I've seen this so often, even with my clients. I come in, my client, one of the senior leaders tells me something, or some of the product managers tell me something. I learn that, I figure out what's going on. I see, okay, there's a lot of patterns here, a lot of similarities with other organizations. Here's how to understand the problem. And I tell the senior management, and it's the same thing, but it works because I'm an external and I've got this luxury now, and it's nothing magical about me. Maybe there is something, but mostly it's not magical about me, but it's mostly about being the external, having that external credibility and lack of agenda. But I'd love to hear an example. Like, do you have an example of that situation, that kind of situation you can talk about without necessarily, obviously we respect client confidentiality and so on, but do you have an example you can talk about that's like where that happened? Like, you can tell us a bit of a color?
I want to just emphasize one thing quickly, because you talked about this thing of having to hear the message maybe from a different source. I think often it's also about the repetition and the different formatting. So in marketing, they
Mm.
talk about this thing of, a customer needs to hear the message 7 to 8 times before they're even aware of your product. And I think part of it is that there's sometimes a little bit of a deficit of leaders kind of err on the side of under communication rather than.
Oh, I've lost you. What's happening here? You still there? I've lost you. Why have I lost you? Let me message you and see if you're still. Have I lost connection or have you lost connection? What's happening?
Are we back?
I think we're back here. Yes, I don't know what happened there. We just seemed to. I lost you and you lost me. Did you?
I could still hear you, but the video briefly glitched. But it's cool.
Don't know.
Um,
Okay, cool.
I was just saying
So
that, like, sort of from a marketing perspective, you need to repeat the message again and again, and it's not just literally say the exact same words verbatim. I think often, do it in a short. I'm trying to remember where I heard of the idea, but write the one sentence, the one paragraph, the one page, and the sort of the 10-page version of the thing, and help people to get that message. Because some people just need the top line, some people need a bit more
right,
detail, and others are going to need a lot of data and stats. And I think very often what happens is that you need that repetition, and so on. And so often what I've done inside the organization is that I've worked with, I'll talk about an example in a second, is actually find the people who are already using those messages or already doing things very similar to what we're trying to do. The
yeah,
rationale is that if we can find places where things are already working quite well, or something that we're trying to sort of make maybe a bit more widespread, we find your team, for example, is already doing it, rather than me coming in and saying, hey, everybody, you should do this thing. I'm the manager or I'm the consultant or whatever. Let's get you as Richard to go and tell your peers, hey, look at this cool
right,
thing that we're doing. It kind of short circuits or circumvents this, well, that doesn't work in our situation, or there's some, secret reason why
yeah.
it can't because we're special or whatever. And so using a lot of that kind of stuff, I think, is super powerful.
Yeah, and I guess
Yeah,
that's one of the things that you're able to do as someone who's dedicated to figuring out how to communicate these things. You have patterns that you can see and put the energy into that. Whereas the internal people, like, you can do that when you're internal. You can sort of
yeah.
amplify some of these messages, but it's quite hard because you also have a job to do.
I think that's part of the challenge. And I describe my work in kind of, I do two things. One is you can sort of rent my expertise. I have some experience in doing these things, and I can show you, or even as like an interim role, I can do it for you. That works for a short period of time, or maybe to get the ball rolling. But really, to sustain the change over a longer period, I have to do the second part, which is teaching other
Yep.
people to do what I can do. And so a lot
Yeah.
of that is finding folks who already know some things about this stuff, maybe tweaking some things, helping unblock them, connecting them to
Mm.
the right folks in the organization, and just connecting them maybe to the broader initiative of what we're trying to do. And then, of course, things like coaching and helping them to level up their skills or learn specific things maybe that they're curious about related to the work that they're doing. And so I
Yeah.
think bringing those two things together is really quite powerful, because I mean, you asked earlier for an example, and one that I've
Yeah.
actually written about a couple of times is an insurance company that I worked with a few years ago. And I use their example, even though it's a little bit older, because it's a really great story, but also it's sometimes hard to talk about current clients because they're busy with things that are maybe a little bit more secretive, and so talking about their context can be a little bit challenging.
Yeah.
But basically what we did there was we looked at the set of work that they were doing. They were saying, we've got these 100 odd people who are doing a bunch of things within the organization. We feel like we could be a lot faster. It's really like there's a lot of work on the go, but not so much actually comes out the other side.
Yeah.
And so we looked at the list of things they were doing. It was around about 400 items across 100 people. And so, yeah, I mean, just massive overworking, too many projects and initiatives on the go. So what we did was we basically worked with a group of folks from all of the different teams across that 100 or so people, and we built one single place where we could visualize all of the projects and initiatives that were happening in that area. And
Oh,
we
wow, okay.
whittled the list down to 15 concurrent items that we would do. So I'll talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about flight levels later on, but essentially this was the first time that I was building a real flight level 2 system inside an organization. I didn't necessarily realize it at the time. I didn't have the vocabulary around flight levels and so on. It was still sort of emerging at the time. But basically the idea was, instead of just focusing on making the team type faster, let's look at how the teams work together to deliver something. Because usually I do something and then you need to do something, or another team, it could be sales, marketing, or customer support, or it could be just some part of software development. and another part of the software development teams.
Yeah.
And so by reducing that amount of work that they were trying to get done at any given time, all we did was we focused our efforts on a few things, reduced that number to 15. And now instead of taking around 12 to 36 months to deliver a project, we were taking 6 to 12 weeks. So this is an enormous
Oh, yep.
improvement. And suddenly you start getting folks like the CFO of the company showing up and going, I'm really quite curious. What have you done here? How does this work? Because I've never seen something like this happen in that short space of time. I mean, we did this in, I think it was like 6-7 months.
Yeah.
And the key thing wasn't like, I mean, I helped and facilitated, and I brought some sort of new insight and focus to them, got them to agree to stuff. But really, a lot of the work was being done by the people who were on the ground, and having the discipline to stick to and focus on actually sticking to those 15 projects. You know, when the head of customer support is saying, what about that thing I really care about? You have to say, well, you know, it's still in the options pool, and we're going to finish one of these 15 before we start that. By the time you're doing, you know, things every 6 to 12 weeks, customer support head doesn't mind so much if they wait 1 quarter and they get it next quarter, versus before they were going to ask for it today and get it 3 years from now. And so there's a little bit more of that responsiveness and predictability with it. And so a lot of the questions that people get asked about, you know, when will this be done? When will this be done? So, well, we're going to do these things and then we'll have a conversation. But when we start, it usually takes a lot less time. And so I think a lot of these kind of things give nice examples. I mean, we can unpack it in a little bit more detail. I have a few other examples as well, but maybe that answers part of your question there.
Yeah, I was going to ask on that topic. Like, I mean, so this is such a common situation for my clients as well, where there's too many things going on. And I was just talking to one last week where the way this company worked was that they're selling to large corporates, large financial institutions in this case, and each one would have a bunch of requirements, and so they'd have to do all these requirements. And every sale they had to make, they had to sign a bunch of agreements to do various extra features for each of these customers, and then it turns into, well, there's too many things going on, but they're all in contracts, they're all written down, and deals that you kind of have to maintain, otherwise you lose your big clients, and you have like 20, 10 big clients or 20 big clients or whatever it is, and then you have 200 small clients who all want something as well. And what's happening here is partially that problem of like, we have 400 things in progress and we can't make progress on any of them because we're just doing too many things at once. But also the other thing that happens with this is that and it's kind of what you mentioned there, but this is a bit different because it's driven by sales, but you lose control of your product roadmap. So now the products are going in a direction that various collections of customers have said. And the challenge that I found with most of these situations is that a lot of the time the people at the coalface can see this problem super clear. It's just like, this is the problem because I'm doing 6 different things at once and it's not working. We need to choose the number of things we're doing. Somehow it doesn't become clear to the senior management. It's very hard for senior management to understand this challenge, especially when you have 100 people, 200, 400 people, and you think, I've got 400 people, I should be able to do, 400 things, right?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that challenge? Like, I mean, because I've got my own ways of dealing with this challenge. I'm keen on understanding yours.
Yeah, I think very often, I mean, I see this all the time, and I think a big part of the challenge in those situations is a lack of really coherent strategy for the organization. It could be, product strategy, it could be the overarching strategy, but often it turns into we're doing sort of panic-driven product development. This customer has paid for the thing, or we signed it in a contract, we sold it to them. I don't think that necessarily having sort of a customer request driven business model where it's like, you take orders and then you deliver stuff, but that's not really a product company. That is more of a service company. You're providing, lines of code or a specific solution to a problem. Whereas if what you're trying to do is actually solve ongoing customer problems. So a great example that I have, I worked in an agency. It was essentially a marketing related agency. And what we were doing was building things like, global Mobi sites for big brands, or like a fantasy football league, for a few million folks in Nigeria. And one of the challenges that we had there was that there were a lot of things that would come up and sort of, we have this emergent need because the sales folks had sold something. And so what we did was one of the things that really helped us in this was to go on a bit of a campaign to work with the folks who were doing the account management and say to them, here are some things that we have already that we have built that you can sell that don't involve any software development time. things like some of the CMS functionality or certain polls and like geolocation features functionality like this, stuff that you can actually sell to a customer, you can bill, and you don't have to wait 6 weeks, 6 months or something for us to build it. And I think as we started to drive more of that, like, here are some things that are not just on the roadmap, because I think there's a sort of an over optimistic kind of tendency to say, well, it's coming in Q3 and it'll be ready. But then by the time Q2 arrives, we're already, 10 other ideas. And so actually saying, let's sell the stuff that we've built rather than going out and building stuff so that we can maybe sell it in the future. The other piece that I think is super helpful, which is more of a product management thing, is actually doing some alignment around, okay, there's 15 customers that have this need. How can we solve it in one way that would fix most of those customers' problems? So we're not building something super customized for every single one. And I think the other biggest thing that really helps in this situation, we didn't manage to do it in that particular company, but I've done it with a few others since then, is again the sequencing. So doing the 15 projects at a time and saying, to take it even one step further, what I normally advocate for is having a very clear single number one, so that you can also have a single number two and a number three. And I think we chatted about this a little bit the other day. Because what I see is that we're running into this challenge, and we use this a lot at Spotify with the company bets, as they were called, the big ticket items that are the focus for the entire organization. We don't want a situation where you're working on number one, I'm working on number two, and I'm interrupting you to come and work on number two. It doesn't make sense. We want number one to get the fast track or to get the priority. And so what we need to actually do in order to make that happen across many teams or across many departments is actually force out that explanation of which one is number one. Secondarily, it's helpful if we also know why it's number one. But just having that sequence, even if it's not necessarily understood all of the motivations for it, just having this is number one, that's number two, that's number three. And I talk about this as not letting your number three block your number one. And this has been enormously, enormously powerful for the companies that have been able to do it. And people sort of say, well, what happens if I can't help on number one? Well, move down the list, do something else meaningful. You don't have to sit around picking your nose. You can do something. I'm sure most people have more than a good enough idea of what else they could do that's useful. But let's at least make sure that, if you need me for something and I'm on number three, I can stop what I'm doing and switch to help you, so that number one keeps moving forward.
That makes sense. I mean, this is really similar to the OKR. The OKR method. It has that sort of as a doctrine almost. And I was working with one customer who they'd been using OKRs, but they hadn't put much discipline into it. So they had literally 16 OKRs for the company, and basically it's like having 16 priorities, and they're all kind of like equal level like us. They're kind of ordered, but they were arbitrarily ordered in some ways, and they wanted to do all of them, and they weren't getting any of them done. And so one of the tools that I use in this is kind of this. It's almost like a almost appeal to authority, in that OKRs are supposed to only have 3 of them. You're supposed to only have 3 because then you can focus. Now, the real underlying thinking here is that if you're doing this, if you're focusing on one thing or 2 things at the expense of other things, that means you can put those resources into that one thing, and then you will succeed in the thing that's really important. And if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. But it also means that if you're doing a little bit of everything and then you're doing everything mediocre, and what it turns out in most strategy conversations is that there is something that is the crux, the thing that's going to make the difference. There's 1 or 2 of these things, then that's the thing. If you kick that out of the park, then your customers are going to run to you, and they're going to put up with something else, like Ryanair, low prices, right? On schedule, but crappy service, no baggage handling, no baggage transfers at all. Like there's none. Bad timing and terrible airports, like at least in my experience. Sometimes it varies, but I remember once flying into, I think it was to somewhere in your neck of the woods, and the airport's actually it's either you're going to Sweden, but your airport's in Norway, or the other way around. It's like the airport's in the other country. It's really close to the border, but still it's like an hour or an hour and a half to get to the city you're supposed to be getting to. Anyway, the thing is that they can trade off all of that by to make it super easy and win on everything else, and they turn out to be the most profitable airline in Europe for good reason, right? Even though I don't like flying them, but they're good at what they're doing. And this is the thing: if everything we do, we have to choose that thing. Choose that one thing, and that's the thing the decision that makes the difference. And this might be a good time to introduce the flight levels. Does that fit to your way of thinking here? Shall I pull it up? Is that a good idea? Because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'll pull this. This is the diagram that we pulled up from that I've taken from your your LinkedIn, and it's
Yeah.
your website and so on as well. I'd love you just to talk us through this and how does this apply to a real situation?
So I basically what we're trying to do with this is create some kind of way to be able to look into an organization and make sense of all of the opportunities and the challenges and problems and so on that we see within the company. We talked about a couple of scenarios. I mean, you used the Ryanair situation. What actually is the key thing that we think will make a difference within the organization? Very often what we see is that most of the organizational improvement efforts are focused very much down there at level one, right close to the teams and close to the actions. We do things like Scrum, Kanban, all kinds of hiring agile coaches and Scrum masters, all of these kind of things. The other place that we tend to put some focus is at level three, in the strategic level, where we say, okay, cool, well, we need to pick out some things and decide what we're going to do. I think this is often a very overlooked. I mean, your Ryanair example kind of illustrates this quite nicely. Is that they've really got clear what their strategy is. I think it's low cost. That is the thing that is most important. I'm amazed by the number of companies where I don't actually see that very clearly articulated. And I think part of the challenge is that in many companies, it's not that the strategy doesn't exist, it's that it's kind of hidden away in a PowerPoint deck somewhere or in somebody's brain. And so what we're trying to do with Flight Levels is actually operationalize that strategy and turn it into something that is real for people in the day-to-day. So instead of just having teams working at level one and strategy working at level two, we've got this bridging space in what we call the coordination in Flight Level 2. And very often what people think of this is they think of it as like a hierarchy. But the thing is, it's actually more akin to levels of abstraction. If you think about task stories and details at level one, big long-term strategic outcomes, be the world's leading low-cost airline, for example, that might be at the top. You need to also turn that into some kind of activities and initiatives that you then actually perform at a broader level that often span many teams, departments, and functions. So what we're trying to do with Flight Levels is look at the system and say, firstly, can we connect things all the way from the top to the bottom, and conversely, from the bottom to the top? Because you, in my experience, can't make a good strategy without taking into account all three levels. Strategy is not just a thing that gets done at the top level of the organization. If it's not feasible to deliver at level one or at level two, or it doesn't make sense because you've got capacity constraints or certain capabilities, or the market is going in a different direction, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is if you can't actually operationalize it and execute it. And so what we're focusing on is connecting the strategy both from the top to the bottom so that everyone can make sense of what they're doing, but also creating these spaces where we can resolve these kind of tensions, where I talked about, like in the marketing, the insurance company, for example, where basically what we're doing is we're saying, let's get a bunch of these teams together. We build something that visualizes the activities that we are performing at level two, and it connects to the strategy at Flight Level 3, and we can make improvements at each level appropriately. So, we're not just trying to get the teams at level one to type faster, or we're not just trying to optimize the strategy. We might say, actually, it's a communication and coordination challenge, which is often the case that I find. And so we help each other, help people to get out of each other's way and to rather support each other more than just trying to do their own thing, if that makes sense.
I wanted to dig deeper into something you said there. You said that this is not just a matter of the I think levels of the organization. It's not a hierarchy. The natural way of reading this, I think, the natural I read this, is that level three is the executive team, and level two is the directors and managers, and level one is the line managers and engineers and teams doing the actual work. I don't think this is correct. I think this is the intuitive way of reading it. But is this what it means, or is this not what it means? Like, how do you relate this back to an org chart, or how do you not relate it to an org chart?
I think that there is some sort of overlap with the org chart, but the problem is if you think about it only through the lens of the org chart, then you start to think about it as roles and hierarchy. I think often hierarchy gets a very bad name, and we can unpack that as a whole separate topic. But there's many situations where actually delegating some responsibility to a single person or a single group or a smaller group of people to make decisions for the collective group are actually more feasible than trying to involve an entire company, an entire family, or an entire country in making decisions. I think there's uses for this. The problem is that we've often seen very bad examples of this. So let's explore that in a minute. But I think what's important for me is that it's not possible, as I say, to make good decisions at the strategic level if you're doing it without some kind of communication and conversation with folks at the other levels. And so what you actually need is a different perspective. So for example, the CFO in the insurance company I talked about, he was hanging out on a flight level 2 system. So he was
Yeah.
talking to the teams at that level and bringing his insight and his perspective, right? Sure, as the CFO, he probably spends most of his time making decisions and thinking about things in the flight level 3 space, but he's not only having access there, and that's not the only place that he can play. But
Yeah.
what he might do is say, cool, I will give you a budget for X amount of months, X amounts of quarters, X amount of heads, or whatever it is, to go and do certain things. But it needs to somehow connect. And so the responsibility there is about creating the conduits between the levels rather than just working only at one level.
Yeah.
And I think often once you sort of move it a little bit away from the sort of the dysfunction that people often experience with hierarchy, it's actually to do with more bureaucracy and slow process, indecisiveness, all of these kind of things.
Yeah.
And when we start to use something like this, we can actually address those challenges, because any one of those 3 teams at level 1 needs to make a decision about what to do. They can go as a representative to that flight level 2 system. There's usually some kind of frequent conversations or interactions around that system. We say we meet every Monday morning, or we check in via Slack or however it is, or
Yeah.
there's a space where that communication happens. And we can say, hey, this thing has happened. We're delayed on our team at our team level, or some new request has come in, or the strategy of the company has changed. This person has been hired, that person got laid off, whatever it is. We need to address this thing. Let's address it in a way that solves for the sort of the broader needs of the entire set of teams, rather than just doing it locally within our own
Yeah.
space. And so just to finish up, the key thing here is that when we're building a flight level 2 system here, we're not just getting the managers involved, we're actually getting representation from each of the teams. Not 100% perfect representation, but
Yeah.
at least one person usually from each team should be able to share that context. And similarly, if you're from team 1 over here and you go to flow, the first flow, for example, at level 2, you would be able to understand a little bit of what's going on. And so we build a better flow of information and understanding.
Yeah.
And that's really the idea.
I'd love to dig in and just practically speaking, what is a flight level 2 flow thing here? But before I do, I'm going to just give you an example from my experience of something that
Yeah.
links strategy level flight level 3 to 1 in a company that I was involved in, which was Amazon. And Amazon, I think, is really fascinating for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is because senior leaders, vice president level, like this is VP level 10, they tend to, for the context of people outside of Amazon has had, when I was there, Jeff Bezos, the CEO, and then they had like 20 or so senior vice presidents and maybe 1,000 vice presidents. But those vice presidents would have like 400 or 800 or 2,000 people working for them. So they're very senior executives in an organization, and they have a lot of decision-making power. But what I found was that what surprised me when I first came there was how deep these level executives get into the operations, like right down that 501, in that usually these people will come along to what we called a weekly business review, where it would be all the metrics from the thing that we're doing. And this, in our case, my area was sales, it was retail and the marketplace. We look at all the metrics for the marketplace, and they'll be digging into different product list items and different categories and different regions and different markets and different pages on the website, and how is this working and all that sort of stuff. And they'd want to see every single week what's the data and what looks a bit weird, or what's not going the way we expect it to, and why is that, and digging into all of these details and asking these whys on that really specific level of detail. And then on the quarterly basis, or either monthly or quarterly, depending on the business, someone would then summarize a lot of this into a slightly higher level discussion. But all of this operational detail would be surfaced to the VPs. And I had never experienced that. I've never experienced in an organization, even at Google for 6 years, senior people did not get their hands dirty. And this is such a strength of Amazon, to have these senior people making strategic decisions at big level decisions and having discussions with the CEO, but they knew the details of what was going on without actually having to do the work themselves. They're getting their fingers dirty, but not actually, like, they're not spending their time doing code and so on. But I found that mechanism of this business review, and in our case, it was just a spreadsheet with data in it. And they have like 10 or 20 pages of this spreadsheet with weekly data on it. And it was just a really fantastic tool to be able to dig into things and get these people in there. But I'd love to hear, what is it? And we had some tools that I think probably represent the flight level 2, but what is a flow? When you say you're designing a flow, what is that?
So there's a couple of different formats that it can take. I mean, in the insurance example that I used, basically what you would see on there is all of the bigger initiatives that we're thinking about doing, the ones that we've done some sort of discovery work on, in addition, the ones that are prioritized and the ones that are actually in flight at any given point in time.
Mhm.
There's a number of different similar concepts that some people may have seen in this space, is like a sort of a Kanban system or a visualization, something like an Obeya or an Obeya room. And what I like to also include on here is also the data and information, such as the metrics, like what you're talking about now. Maybe there's some sort of graph of anything from product performance, maybe uptime, availability, sales channels, use cases, defects, whatever it is. Like there's
Yeah.
all of the information that is needed to be able to make good decisions at this level. And what we're trying to do is really create something that is, as I describe, an information radiator. And I think often what folks have done, similar to the slide deck for the strategy level, they've made something that is much more of an information refrigerator. So it's kind of, it keeps it, it holds it, and it's kind of protecting it forever and ever.
Yeah.
But it's not radiating it out into the org.
Yeah.
And in my experience, sharing a slide deck or a metric sheet or whatever without some kind of contextual explanation or discussion ongoing, it's relatively meaningless. I mean, you might guess some bits and pieces, but there's nuance in the context that's hard to get. And so
Yeah.
often what you would see in this space is that there would be something like similar to like you might do with a Scrum team or something, essentially a stand-up or synchronization conversation. I have an example from Spotify of where we did this. It was about 100 people again across this flight level 2 system. It was growing pretty fast. It was about 350-ish by the time the format sort of shifted. But basically 100 people could meet around this system every morning, actually, and have a quick conversation about what were the issues that emerged. It would take 10 to 15 minutes. And then we know that everybody is in sync and knows what the most important thing for them to spend their time on for the day is. And yeah, on there you would have things like
Yeah.
hiring, maybe improvement work, any kind of release or major blocking issues, as well as all the projects, initiatives, and so on that were happening. And so
Yeah.
what you get is visibility of the group as a whole, like how we're actually a team. It's not just here's what the
Yeah.
developers are doing. It's the managers, the coaches, the facilitators, the operations people, the sales teams, everybody is on there. And we can see, oh, this is how we're planning to actually win the game. And this is, let's go and run today's game and see what happens. And tomorrow we sync up and check. I don't say you have to do it every day, but, figure out a rhythm that makes sense. But,
Yeah.
in your case, you were saying, on a couple of weeks or a monthly basis, and again, on a quarterly basis, maybe at a different sort of a different time horizon. But I think something like this is really, really quite powerful.
Yeah, for sure. And who's involved in that? Is that like everyone on the coalface is involved, or just the managers, or?
Yeah. So in this case, what we were doing is we had 100% of the people were invited. The expectation was not that everybody
Mm.
had to attend, but we were wanting at least one person from each of the teams was
Right.
expected to attend. And so each team would, maybe nominate someone. Sometimes there would be more than one person. Quite often, the attendance was quite close to 100%, actually, because folks found it interesting, and it was only a 10, 15-minute investment. It was really, really high value use of their time.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge is that a lot of companies, quite frankly, they just have really, really shitty meetings, to be honest. And so they run into a lot of challenges where, you're sitting there boring while somebody reads out a status report of something that, like, it really is already an email. It's not even, it could have been an email. It is already an email.
Yeah.
Why do I have to listen to you reporting and drilling down into those questions? Like, if it's a conversation between two people, just go and have it between those two people. What we
Yeah.
want to do is iron out, okay, I've done this thing and I need your help, but your effort is currently allocated to something else, or you're focusing on something else. So simple scenario, I mean, that team was growing super, super fast. I mean, we hired 90 odd people in about 6 months.
Yeah.
So we had to onboard them, interview them, all of that. So I could have a very real situation where right now I need to fix this defect that is blocking the release of the entire Spotify iOS app, but I also have an interview to attend at 12 o'clock. So I need to either somehow figure out how to prioritize those two, or I say to the group, hey, could somebody take the interview, or could somebody take this bug, and I will take the other one. And so we could
Yeah.
iron out that kind of a thing, which is, I mean, it's a fairly simple example, but it's amazing how often those things are just left to sort of ad hoc, or like we kind of hope it'll get sorted out. But
Yeah.
being able to say, actually, and everyone can be involved, and you can see, hang on, there's a pattern where these systems are constantly breaking, or those kind of products are always in, getting emergency requests. Let's actually look sort of deeper and figure out what's the underlying challenge here,
Mm.
so that we can fix something. But the main point is, like, we need to figure out how to run better conversations and interactions here.
Yeah.
And when it's a huge volume of information that is mostly only relevant to one person, send it an email, put it in a doc, or have a one-to-one conversation. But where it's relevant to the group, yeah, sure, have the group together. And
Yeah.
I think there's so many things that could be improved in this space as well. So yeah.
This is one of the things that I think makes the difference, like the quality of conversation and the quality of meetings in particular, because meetings are really about conversation and about discussion and about decision making and getting people aligned on something, getting a group of people together to either solve a problem or make a decision or make a compromise or whatever you need to do. But the quality of those conversations is really important in an organization. And so when organizations are doing OKRs and they're not going very well, it's usually because these meetings degenerate into either a brainstorming session or a reporting session, and there's not much outcome from this. We're not actually engaging brains in things and solving problems. And when you can surface these kinds of issues, now the one you're mentioning there is kind of a relatively detailed issue of one person, but in the executive teams, you might be an issue where we're trying to build this system, but actually we're not getting access to our customers because sales are not getting access to our customers, or they're not really, letting us engineers go and talk to the customers or whatever we're doing. And now you're having that conversation at that high enough level that people can make a change and solve that problem. They can see the connection between that and the objectives they're trying to achieve, the key results they're trying to build. What are we trying to do here? And then we see this problem being surfaced, and now we can actually solve the problem. And now we're having a conversation about the things that are holding us back as an organization, and that gets resolved. But that's been the thing that makes the massive difference. By having that conversation at different levels of the organization, I do mean here organizational levels, but having that at different organizational levels is super important, and making sure that those conversations are not wasted with updates. They're really about like solving problems.
Yeah, I find it fascinating how often I've been in a meeting where it's somehow become totally acceptable for several of this senior members of staff to sit in there and basically be on their phone or on Slack or working on other things during the meeting. And I mean, to me, this is just absurd. Like, it's a sign of, in my experience, I think it's just weak leadership of the individuals who are behaving like that, but also of the others who just accept and tolerate it. And I don't usually, in my situations, I mean, maybe not on day dot do I jump in and kind of dump on everybody, but it's like, folks, we've come here to solve something or to deal with a challenge. Like, we all are busy. We have other things to do. But if we can't have this conversation effectively, we're going to have this meeting again and again and again. We're not actually going to solve the issue. And I think a big part of what I've found is super important in this is actually finding a way to, once we're a little bit clearer through having the flight levels visualization, we know what is actually important. We start to be able to see which things are actually moving and which ones are not. And that gives us a little bit of, I say, courage in a way, I think, to actually lean in and focus on those things and say, hey, like, we've talked about this thing 17 times. And every time we talk about it, it's like, oh, nothing to report. It's going fine. And then like all of a sudden it's like, I mean, you've probably seen these red, amber, green statuses, like green, 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 amber, red, as we get closer to release. And I think that it's just absurd that companies keep doing that and just accepting that that's somehow an acceptable thing. It's like, I know that you can't know that thing's going to be perfectly flawless, but what are you doing about it? What are we going to do about it? How is it somehow acceptable to just show up in the meeting again and again, spend the entire time on Slack, and then tell me, you got nothing to update? Like, I mean, I don't know if that would fly at Amazon, but it certainly wouldn't fly in my company. I find it really strange how consistently bad people's meetings are, and how they just, that's just how it is. And I don't blame the individuals really so much. I mean, there's people inside there. I mean, it's painful to be the one who's going to be that person and go, I'm sorry, this meeting sucks. What are we doing? Like, But
and so often the person who that's sort of expressed to, or the people who are responsible for solving that problem, don't actually have the tools to know how to fix it as well. It's a real challenge, because often enough these meetings are just have momentum, and it's that's what we do. We have a team meeting. We need a team meeting. We have to have a team meeting, don't we? And I need updates, so let's put the updates in the team meeting. And now we've got a reason to have a team meeting, and it's very hard to get people to have that realization of, what am I actually using this meeting for? What's my purpose of this? But actually asking that question is really high value, and that's where you add a whole lot of value. But I think now's a good time to talk about customers, and because I don't think that, I'm having a wild guess here, but I'm guessing not many people say, hey, Cliff, come and help us because our meetings suck. Maybe they do. Maybe that is the pain point. But come and help us because I can't run a meeting. Maybe that is likely. I don't know. Maybe that's how they come to you. But what's the problem that people actually come with? What's the actual pain point that they say, hey, Cliff, I've got this problem and it hurts? And why do they come to you about that?
It usually sounds like some variation of we've added a bunch of people into our company, and we're struggling to find some. We feel like we're getting slower. Basically, we're not speeding up at the rate that we were expecting, and
Yeah.
I think this makes sense. In a lot of, especially in faster growth companies, if you're more of a startup, which I often work with companies sort of in the earlier stages, as they're growing, they're adding people, and it just feels like we're bumping into each other, we're running into challenges. People are saying like, I don't know what I'm accountable for. I'm not sure if it's your job or my job, like all of this kind of stuff. And so we spend some time building something that looks like the picture that I showed you earlier, or that you were showing earlier, around the flight level system, to say, okay, not only which topics are we talking about at which level. So, if you're in the team at level 1, you're responsible for making these decisions. And so you can autonomously operate within the boundaries and constraints that are set at that system.
Yeah.
Similarly, at level 2, it's a bit more zoomed out. You can make decisions about projects, initiatives. And also, here are the communication loops. You need to talk to level 3 if something is significantly changed or delayed. Similarly, you need to talk to these level 1 teams if something is going to shift order or priority, or these kind of things. And so we're basically constructing something over time. And you can do it in a lot of different tools. You can do it in a lot of different kind of, like, the physical artifacts are not really the important thing. They are an aspect of it, but it's really, do we have a healthy and productive conversation around these things? And have we built consistent habits that allow us to create focus? I talk about this as create focus. So creating focus, where are we creating focus? Finding the leverage, so the key things that are really going to drive this forward, and building the habits to sustain it. And so, yeah, if we're dealing with a situation where there's a ton of things on the go, we're not sure which ones to fix, we're hired a bunch of new people, and we're not really sure how to, get better effectiveness. Often there's kind of people complaining and saying, 2 years ago we were super quick. Now it feels like there's tons of bureaucracy, all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
These are exactly the challenges that I get excited about and that I love helping with, because it's what I did at Spotify for 4.5 years. It's what I've done at the insurance company I mentioned before, and previously when I was in telecoms working in product management. And it's what I'm doing still now. I think when you see folks having that experience of, like, it was wild, it was crazy, it was chaotic, it was mayhem the whole time, and now suddenly I feel like I can breathe, and I know when we're making progress. That's the thing. It's like, I actually know when we're succeeding, and I'm pretty confident that when things are not working, I actually know that they're not working, and so we can do something about it. So you can sort of sleep easier at night.
For sure.
Yeah.
And is this the main problem that people have? It's at the coordination level, or is it sort of all over the place?
A lot of the time it is at the coordination level. In many cases, it's either that the level 2 is non-existent, or just kind of very fuzzy and so on.
Yeah.
One of the challenges I find is that a lot of organizations try to address that sort of lack of coordination by hiring project managers, at least, which
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for, and I think project managers can be hugely beneficial to an organization. But the challenge is that if I'm a project manager driving my projects and you're a project manager driving your projects, we're still a little bit in conflict with each other, because we probably need some of the same people to do stuff. And so what we need is a way to address that tension in a way that I'm not getting in your way and you're not getting in mine. We can actually work together and help each other out.
Yeah.
And I don't pretend like it's all magic and ponies and everything's super easy, but at least if the company and we have all collectively made a decision, your thing is number 1, my thing is number 3, I need to respect that. And anytime I'm behaving like my thing is number 1 at the expense of your number 1, we need to address that, and we need to solve that problem, because it doesn't make sense that we continue to behave in that way. And that's kind of why I address the meetings, but it's also sort of individual behavioral things. Somebody saying in the teams, hey, Cliff keeps interrupting me, asking me to do this thing. Oh, can't you just help out? It's like, I'm busy on Richard's thing, and that's the number 1 thing. So sorry, dude, you're going to have to come back, or you're going to have to wait. And like,
it's
otherwise we're just shooting ourselves in the foot.
It's painful but necessary. And this is how, like, how the actual strategic decisions materialize in practice, and they have to mean these trade-offs. If they don't mean trade-offs, you're not making decisions, you're not implementing decisions. So that makes a great deal of sense. So when you get involved, what do you actually do? Are you doing training or coaching or workshops, or whiteboard courses, or what are you doing?
So there's a couple of things. It can take a number of different forms. Usually there is some kind of workshopping and so on involved, but then my role is much more of a facilitator / teacher. I teach some concepts and we learn how to build these systems. But very often the way that we start is I have a conversation with somebody like the CTO or the person who's running the program office, one of the senior execs, something like this. And we try to identify what what are the challenges that we're trying to solve? So, we've got these 5 different organizations, they're not necessarily working well together, or we've been struggling to build those collaboration loops, or we've got tons and tons of teams, we're not really sure how they should interface with each other. Let's go and build that. And so we have a bit of conversation to figure that out. And I usually coach them through and facilitate that conversation. What actually are the problems that we're solving? Because so often I see us starting to execute on some kind of change initiative before we've really grasped what is actually going on. And I think more than having a perfectly crisp, crystal clear understanding, what we need to at least do is separate, hey, there's 17 things here. Which one are we picking? More than did we pick perfectly the right one? Because if we pick the one and we go and do it, then we can find out, oh, actually, it doesn't give as much traction as we thought. Let's pick number 2 instead. But now we have the benefit of knowing from what we did on number 1, what's working and what's not. So that really is, it's much more of a focusing mechanism than it is like a perfect understanding mechanism. And then I spend a lot of time coaching the leaders in that space. There's some challenges and tensions that surface. So, it could be things like the meeting stuff that I talked about. It could be something like, hey, we've got tons and tons of teams, and the folks in the PMO are asking us to use this tool, but we're really busy. We don't have time to get on board with the tool. How do we actually have a good conversation around that? And can we facilitate maybe a better discussion around those kind of things, as well as teaching them the models and tools to be able to make these decisions effectively.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So people, if like basically flight levels is kind of like the framework that you use to unify all this thinking and sort of pull it together into bits and pieces, but there's solutions that go deeper than that.
I think of it as a thinking model, really. It's the essence here is that it's a way to look at the organization and think about where should we be solving challenges or looking for opportunities. And I think it's kind of in response to the situation. Klaus, who's sort of the creator of this model, basically what he talks about in this space is saying, we were focusing on trying to get each of the teams to push the key on the keyboard as fast as possible. But the reality is that we actually need the right team pushing the right key at the right time. And to do that, we don't focus on improvements in the team. We focus on the interactions between the teams and the interface into the strategy. And I think that's kind of the blend, that we're getting folks to think a little bit about some things. And I think it's a pity because a lot of folks are doing, many different, everything from OKRs to, agile methods and digital transformation, design thinking, all of these things. These are all great tools in many different ways. They don't generally tend to address this problem that I'm talking about here of the interactions between the teams. They can help, they can augment. OKRs can create some kind of an interface and a point of conversation, but it's not really trying to address that. What is the conversation that happens between all 17 teams in your department, and how does that interface to the strategy? It's kind of implied through a lot of things, but I think I see this as something that organizations need to do in addition to some of the other things that they have to do, such as OKRs and so on. That can be some tools that they can use, but the challenge is often, I keep reminding folks, hey, there's this change work and these initiatives that you're introducing, your OKRs, your whatever other, agile digital transformation, so on, that's consuming the same capacity as the product development. And so you have to actually prioritize these things relative to each other. Is, your agile transformation the number 1 thing, or is it the number 17? Is the number 17, then don't be surprised that it gets a lot lower priority. And if you don't clarify that, you're going to have the same issue that I talked about before with everybody bumping into each other. And so we want to iron that out.
We should have another conversation sometime about OKRs, because the way I use OKRs is like the OKRs part is the very small goal setting part, but actually we spend most of our time on making sure those conversations happen, because that's where the value is. And in some sense, OKRs to me is a Trojan horse to make sure we're having those conversations and to help make that change. But we can talk about that another time because we're pretty much out of time. How can people best get in contact with you if they want to work with you on anything we've discussed today?
The best way to find me is either on LinkedIn or just go to my website, so cliffhazel.com, or find me, Cliff Hazel, on LinkedIn. I post a lot of these kind of thoughts, podcasting and writing and all of this, so you can find out and see some of the things that I'm thinking about. But just reach out to me and drop me a message. I'm happy to chat and have a further conversation. Otherwise, jump into some of the stuff that I'm offering. And the workshops, everything is all on the website. And of course, the posts and everything are free on LinkedIn. So jump on there. I'd love to connect and hear what you think about it and what you're using it for and how it's helping. So, yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Cliff. Well, that's everything for today. Thanks very much for listening. If you think you need help with OKRs or the leadership topics I work with and other things like that, you can go to book.talktorichard.com and schedule some time on my calendar. Happy to hear from you. I look forward to hearing from you. If it's not a good time, you prefer to just get more updates, subscribe to my newsletter, to my website, richardrussell.co, or follow me on LinkedIn, and the links will be in the show notes if you want to find that. So, Cliff, thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. Hang on the line for a minute afterwards. We'll have a brief chat afterwards, but we'll end the broadcast now. Anyone who's listening, thanks very much for participating. Feel free to drop a comment in afterwards, wherever you are. We'll get to it later on. If they've come up and they haven't appeared for us, then we'll look at it later on as well. All right. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.